Om Param Parastham Gahanadanadim Ekam Nivishtham Bahudha Guhasu Sarvalayam Sarvacharacharastham Tvameva Shambhu Sharanam Prapadye Tvameva Shambhu Sharanam Prapadye. Om, I take refuge in you alone, Shambhu, you who are non-different from Para, the supreme goddess, who is inseparable from Bhairava. Salutations to that reality which abides beyond the forest of transmigratory existence, who is beginningless and eternal, who is non-dual, who manifests herself in the hearts of all the variously manifested beings. She is the ground in which all things rest, wholly immanent in the moving and unmoving. I praise that Para Devi. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat. Ma. Jai Ma. So we're at a very, very important moment in our text now. I mean, there are many, many important moments in our text, but this is a particularly important moment, I think, because we're asking this question: what's the difference between a sentient entity and an insentient entity, given that all things are verily Shiva? Remember, the central claim of this tradition and of this text is Sarvam Sarvatmakam. Everything is everything, or everything is just the one appearing as the many. And more importantly, that one is God. So instead of saying Sarvam Sarvatmakam, it makes more sense to say Sarvam Shivatmakam. All this is verily Shiva. This is the Mahavakya. And importantly, because all this is verily Shiva, I myself am that Shiva. You'll have to recall the one indubitable fact that can never be denied, because to deny it is to prove it, is the fact of your own existence. This is where we start in Indian philosophy, arguably, not always, but this is a good place to start as any. It's the best place to start because it's the one indubitable fact. You know, even in mathematics, to do mathematics, you have to present axioms, and those axioms are not indubitable. That's why the work of like people like Godel and whatnot is so disconcerting sometimes, because you take math to be this like factual thing, but it's not. It's a system. It's a system of logic, and logic itself requires certain axioms. So, like Aristotle, he presents these syllogisms, and he's like, if something is X, it can't also be not X. So there's a law that says a thing can either be X or not X, but it can't be both X and not X at the same time. That would violate a law of logic. But just because it violates a law of logic doesn't mean it's impossible for a thing to be X and not X at the same time. No, because the laws of logic are not necessarily indicative of the way reality works. They try to mirror reality to the best of its ability. They try to give us tools to inquire into reality, but they don't necessarily map onto reality. So almost all disciplines, all fields of study will require some kind of axiom to begin studying. You know, you'll need some kind of mathematical axiom, a set of axioms, geometrical axioms even, to begin doing mathematics. And all of those can be doubted. So almost everything is like a Tower of Babel. Nothing is built on sure foundations. Like everything is built on a series of axioms that invite verification, and oftentimes we find that it's lacking. We can't really verify these axioms because ultimately they're arbitrary. Sometimes we just like make up axioms in order to be able to do something. And you know that can go a long way, but it's still built on shaky footing. The firmest foundation for any philosophy, arguably, is the one indubitable axiom. And there is only arguably one indubitable axiom, and it's this: that I am. What I am, as we've discussed previously, is up for grabs. We can discuss the what all day long and all epoch long. For yuga after yuga, we've been discussing the what. But the that, it's indubitable. So I am. No one can deny that. And if I try to deny that, I've already affirmed that. Netito mama udrekat. The very fact that I say I am not, I've already affirmed that I am. For I am that one to whom the negation occurred. So this is where we began. We began with I am. Now we have to ask, what is the nature of that I amness? And the claim from this tradition is Sarvam Sarvatmakam. Everything is in everything, or rather, Sarvam Shivatmakam. That God, Shiva, the all-encompassing reality which we call Ma, exists. She is existence itself, and she is in everything. And I can't deny that I also exist. In fact, this is the one thing I can't deny, that I exist. So when you bring these two claims together, it's a very stunning and startling discovery. That God who is all pervasively present is one and the same with this reality that I am. And this alone exists. So this reality which I am, this conscious being which I feel myself to be, it alone exists, and everything shines in me as me. But if that's true, If everything is indeed Shiva, and if Shiva is defined as consciousness, and if I am indeed nothing but consciousness, why then do I feel like this discrete individual? Why do I feel like an instantiation of consciousness which feels itself to be distinct and unique and different from other instantiations of consciousness, which I call other people and other beings? So I look into the world and I see here are all these people. There's Amanda Ma in the UK, and there's Karameshwari over there, which I missed in Rochester. I couldn't get to see her actually. And then there's Joanna in Brazil. There are all these different people, and I recognize them as conscious beings that are unique from me. There's Paula. Good to see you, Ma. I'm so happy the books arrived safely. We've missed you, Jaima. And then there's Dominique, and everyone here are people, and I look at them and I say, these are other people. And like I was saying previously, I assume that they are conscious in the way that I am conscious, mostly because they look like me. They have the same nose and the same eyes, with differences, of course, but they all more or less look like me. They're human beings. And so I, as a human being, will be able to then infer that they must be like me. So that's what I do. But I still feel different from them. They're like me, they're conscious like me, but I'm conscious and I'm discrete. And then we look at animals and we say, oh, they behave like us to some extent. They eat the food and they're hungry and they get angry and they cry when we leave the house, or they're happy when we come back. They wag their tails. They do all of these things that demonstrate that they're happy and sad, that they're motivated by food and reproduction and fear and all these things that we relate to. And we're like, oh, I can see myself in these animals. And so they're like me in one sense, but they're also not like me in another sense. They don't have perhaps the structures of, they don't go to university, for instance, and it's not that important for the dog to go to university. It doesn't feel itself inadequate if it didn't get a Bachelor of Arts in some kind of unemployable liberal arts major or something. Like the dog doesn't have that concern, presumably. We don't know. But presumably it doesn't. And so it's not like me in some regards. Or it depends on me maybe for its food or something. Or maybe it doesn't have the language structures that we have. These are all assumptions, but they're assumptions that we make. The dog is like me, but not as much as like Amanda is like me. So in our mind, we know that the dog is conscious, the cat is conscious, but maybe not quite in the same way that Amanda is conscious. And then when it comes to plants, that's where it gets very interesting. Because it wasn't until up till recently, arguably, that we started to take the consciousness of plants quite seriously. But that's also based on the fact that scientists like J.C. Bose and others did studies to demonstrate that plants react, that plants have almost like will, if you will, to move towards the sun and away from the dark, to move towards this mineral or that mineral. So J.C. Bose, he actually won a Nobel Prize for this. One of the first few Indians to be recognized by the Nobel Committee for Science. So he won the Nobel Prize for proving, to some extent, that plants make decisions, that they're somewhat conscious. So there's life in plants, and then there's that somewhat controversial book, The Secret Life of Plants and whatnot. So we have these ideas that there are plants, there are animals, there are human beings, and who knows what else, and they are conscious. But isn't that interesting? Why should they all appear so discrete and appear all so different if indeed there is only one reality, and that reality is Shiva, and I am Shiva? So that's a question worth asking. And a much more important question that we ought to ask is, what about the rocks? What about this teacup? What do we make of the things that aren't seemingly sentient? And so that's the topic that we're discussing recently, the sentience of seemingly insentient objects. This is a profound claim, a startling, radical, and thrilling claim that the tradition of non-dual Shaivism makes as early as Somananda, that even seemingly inanimate objects are indeed conscious, exactly in the way that I am conscious, as we hear in Vijnana Bhairava verse 105, as we hear in Somananda's Shiva Drishti and others. So everything is everything. In other words, everything is one thing, and that one thing is none other than God, who is pure consciousness, which is what I am at my very essence nature. So if I am conscious because I am consciousness, so too are all these rocks. That's the claim. And to establish that claim, we're having this discussion. So what are other people? What are rocks? And in what sense are we all one? In what sense am I that one which appears in all? But I think an even deeper and more practical question, which has to do with our sadhana, a less philosophical and theoretical question, is this. If I am Shiva, why don't I feel like it? So all of this can be summed up as the problem of individuation. If there is indeed consciousness, why does there appear to be discrete consciousnesses? And if Shiva is defined as the all-expansive, unlimited consciousness, then what am I in relation to that? If I am Shiva, why don't I feel like it? So it's also the question of bondage, and seeming liberation. Liberation would be that jnana of the form I am Shiva. So when one is able to understand and affirm with the full being that I am Shiva and know it, when one knows that, they are free. And that's why Abhinavagupta opens his Tantra Sara with this claim. He says, Jnana moksha karanaha. Iha jnana moksha karanaha. It's jnana, knowledge that is liberative. And ajnana is nothing but bondage. So bondage is nothing but ajnana, and liberation is nothing but jnana. But what is that jnana? The jnana that I am Shiva, I am the absolute, and all of this appears within me as that also. So that's the distinguishing feature between one who is identifying with the expansive I versus one who is identifying with the contracted I. So this whole conversation of expansion and contraction is what's also being invoked by this discussion. It's a very important discussion on the status, the epistemological and ontological status of seemingly inanimate objects in a philosophy that argues that everything is consciousness and conscious, and as well as my status as a bound, quote unquote, seemingly bound soul. And understanding why I feel myself to be a person, a discrete unit of consciousness, is key in understanding why I'm actually not just that I'm actually all pervasively present in all things as all things. So this is the claim. Shiva is consciousness, and Sarvam Shivatmakam. Everything is Shiva. Everything is consciousness. So we're establishing that. Anyway, it's Guru Purnima, and it's nice to just take a moment to reverently commemorate the fact that we get to study this text. It's a very remarkable thing that the Paramartha Sara of Abhinavagupta has been preserved and has come down to us for our study and for our contemplation. And it's also important to note that Abhinavagupta is going to great lengths in this text, in the Paramartha Sara, to make this very esoteric, very exalted philosophy available to everyone. He's writing for a public audience. So arguably in Paramartha Sara, we have one of our most public-facing forms of Abhinavagupta. Which brings me to an important point. Janam Jaima. Yeah, save that. It's very good. There's an important point I want to make, that there are different authors within the non-dual Shaiva tradition all over India and different places, of course, and they all have like a different audience in mind, which sometimes colors their transmission. So one of my favorite masters within this tradition, and one of the masters that we're studying right now is Somananda, who we're going to talk about a lot today, because he actually argues that rocks are conscious, that rocks, that chairs, that pots, that pieces of cloth have will. Each one is imbued with omnipotent will, actually, and each one is actually omniscient. So the cloth is omnipotent, omniscient, the way that Shiva is omnipotent and omniscient, because the cloth is Shiva. And so the cloth wills to be a cloth. The cloth knows that it's a cloth, and it acts as a cloth. For in truth, it desires to be a cloth. Shiva desires to be a cloth, and therefore that cloth is playing out its swadharma. The same way that Paula makes digital art. Like the same way that we do the thing that we love to do, the cloth loves to be a cloth, and therefore it is. And if Shiva didn't desire to be a cloth, and if the cloth wasn't conscious, it wouldn't be. This is the claim, and it's a tremendously like pantheistic claim, arguably, and it's very radical. But partly it's because Somananda was not addressing a wide audience. Like when Somananda composed the Shiva Drishti, he was able to present the most radical, uncompromising notion of non-duality because he was only speaking to a small group of tantric initiates. His work was not meant for a non-initiate community or a non-tantric community. It was not meant for Shaivas in general. It was meant for a small group of tantric initiates, and therefore he was at liberty to speak a little more dramatically. And you see this with the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna too. There are moments when Sri Ramakrishna kind of looks around, and when he notices that no outsiders are there, it's just his inner circle, then he reveals some really crazy stuff. Because there are things that are meant for the private audience and things that are meant for a larger audience, which might be lost in translation, which might be misunderstood or misapplied if handled without nuance. So therefore, it's arguably the case that Christ, Buddha, they all had an inner circle, and there are inner teachings that the Christ offers that are maybe different from the teachings that he offers to the public. That's fair. It's fair for a teacher to stratify his or her or their community to be able to responsibly give the information that is required for each person at each stage of their journey to make progress. So in that sense, what Somananda is offering is really exalted. It's really refined and really radical. And therefore, the people who he was presenting it to were most suited to understand what he was saying. And that's the beauty of Somananda. It's like, in my opinion, one of the most profound revelations within the non-dual Shaiva tradition. And it's philosophical. Whereas the Shiva Sutra and the Spandakarika are more yogic and mystical, the Shiva Drishti is a philosophical presentation of those mystical ideas. So obviously Somananda is rooted in a few central tantras. He's rooted in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra most of all, I think. Because like we were saying last night at our Vijnana Bhairava Tantra class, there are like uncanny similarities between the Vijnana Bhairava's approach and Somananda's approach, especially when it comes to spiritual practice. So in book 7 of Somananda's Shiva Drishti, or chapter 7, you can call it, you find these practices, and they're one to one what the Vijnana Bhairava is doing. So he redefines japa as a continuous contemplation of the highest reality. He redefines Homa as being fully satiated as Shiva. He redefines bathing, sacred bath, snanam, as saying I am Shiva with a mind full of delight. He says, Shivo smiti manohlada jalasnanam paramataha. This is the true bath. When you can affirm to yourself, I am Shiva with a mind full of delight. So he does this kind of thing like this is the true japa, this is the true meditation, this is the true bath, this is the true puja, like that. This is the true homa. Like he takes all these practices that you're already familiar with as practicing tantrikas and he reinterprets them along radical non-dual lines. And not only that, he's against the idea of purity and impurity. So one of the most radical things in Somananda is he doesn't believe that there's anything in this universe that is impure because everything is Shiva. You know, other non-dual traditions still have notions of impurity. Impurity would be agyana, avidya. So in a tradition that says the world is void or an illusion, then in that tradition, impurity is of the form, taking the world to be real or permanent when it's not. So ignorance is impermanence. Sorry, impermanence, the experience of impermanence when not recognized is ignorance, and that ignorance is mala or impure. Ashuddha, it's called. So in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, the world, the entire world is actually impure. It's not that some things are pure and some things aren't, like in the case of Vedic Brahmanical standards. It's like everything is impure because everything is ignorance. It's all void, it's all illusion. But here, everything is Shiva. And Shiva, by definition, is auspiciousness itself. The word Shiva means the auspicious one. So everything is auspicious, like feces, wine, meat, outcasts like Chandalas and Shudras. Everything is pure. Everything is maximally divine, equally divine even. And that's a stunning idea because he's a Brahmana. Somananda is a Brahmana speaking to other Brahmanas in a time when Brahmanas were very puritanical. You know, they were very careful about what they ate. They were very careful about who they ate with. You know, a Brahmana, if you were to look at their food, they won't be able to eat that food anymore. It's polluted. And there's like, there's a reason for this, you know, there are energetics to this and whatnot. But what Somananda is suggesting is so radical because he's saying you can eat whatever you want. God forbid. I mean, that's not so radical now, right? Like now in this day and age, it's like, oh yeah, duh, because we had the Enlightenment and the age of rationality and all that. So now we're not so like fanatical. But like Christians were very careful about what they ate. You know, the early Christians were mostly vegetarian in Rome because they were afraid to eat the meat that was offered in the cult of worship of the emperor. That meat was like not halal, so to speak, for the early Christians. So a lot of them were vegetarian, and it was food that split the Gentiles and the Jewish movement within Christianity. Like James and Peter were like, I don't know that we can sit at the same table with all these Gentiles that Paul is bringing in, you know, kind of like that concern, whether or not like the Jewish diet, the kosher diet is compatible with the Gentile diet. And that was a big deal for Christianity. In Buddhism also, you can see that it's less of a big deal. The Buddha was famously able to eat anything because he was a bhikshu, he was a beggar. And as a beggar, the idea is that you shouldn't be discerning about what you're given. And so they say he ate the poisoned pork because he was a bhikshu. So Buddha perhaps ate meat and maybe his monks ate meat. And there are like rules within the Buddhist ethical canon where it's like you can't eat meat if that meat was killed for you. You know, so if somebody were to take a goat out into the backyard and kill it and cook a goat curry just for you to host you as a guest, you can't eat that meat because now you're part of the causal chain that led to the death of that goat. But if the goat curry is already there, then don't be a wimp, eat it. Somebody already prepared it, like just eat it like that. That idea, there are all these ethics around food. Religion is very much intertwined with food. You'll notice in all the religions in the world. Food is an important part. Why? Because religion is about the mind, it's about our psyche. And only now we're starting to understand that the gut is a kind of mind too. So the gut belly responds to food the way the mind, the gut mind or the belly mind responds to food the way the mind responds to data or media, you know. So we have to be careful about our diet when it comes to music and movies and conversations, but we definitely have to be careful of our diet when it comes to, surprise, surprise, diet. So religion is very serious about this kind of thing. So a Brahmana would not only have been vegetarian, strictly vegetarian, but they also would have avoided things like mushrooms. Mushrooms are tamasic, or leeks. In the, and not to make fun of any, this is important stuff. Like this was a very big part of that tradition. They would avoid mushrooms, they would avoid leeks. Obviously, the bottom feeder thing, the whole kosher thing is already included because they weren't eating any meat anyway. Um, Interestingly, they weren't eating even garlic and onion, perhaps. There were various things, not just that they were vegetarian, there were various things also within that vegetarian diet that was, yeah, prohibited to them. And eggplant, like various things like that, for various reasons. Anyway, it's not just that, it's also with whom they eat. So a Brahmana can't just share a meal with anybody. In fact, once the Swami made a joke. He said, here in this country, everyone pees in private and eats in public. Whereas in our country, they pee in public but eat in private. You know? So eating is something very sacred, and that's why I think your first date, it's nice to have a dinner date because you're exchanging energy in a very intimate way, you know. So we have to be careful with whom we eat. So that's why dinner dates are very intimate. Eating with someone is intimate. So the Brahmanas are very careful about that. They won't eat with other castes. And not only that, if somebody were to see their food, it would be made impure just by the very gaze. It becomes uchishta through gaze. Gaze is very powerful in this context. So you can't eat food that's been looked at. You have to take a bath if you've touched the wrong person or touched the wrong thing. If you even so much as smell wine, you have to go and do your ablutions again and take ritual baths. So all of that. This is a culture that preserved its spiritual sensitivity through very rigorous rule following. And you have to respect that. You have to respect, no matter what, that the highest caste, if you want to think in terms of hierarchy, was also the most restricted and poorest. That's, I think, quite beautiful. It's not that way these days. You know, prior to the Mughal invasion, prior to the British invasion, it was the case often that the highest, most revered members of society were also the most restricted and restrictive members of society. And so that was the world that Somananda was in. Obviously, Somananda was a high class Brahmin because he was a Brahmana in the court of various kings. During his time, many kings came and went. There was a great king in Kashmir named Avanti Varman, and it said that during the rule of King Avanti Varman, many great avatars, many great Shaiva masters came, Siddhas came to teach the tradition. But Somananda lived during a time when there was a lot of political instability, a lot of different rajas were coming in and coming out, but he was a court pundit. So he was very close to royals. He was probably also quite well off because the patronage was probably really good. But Brahmanas are not allowed to charge for knowledge. They can just give knowledge and wait for kings to like subscribe to their Patreon or something. You know, it's all patronage based. But Somananda had good patrons, very good kings and whatnot. So he was not a poor Brahmana, but he was a Brahmana nonetheless. And so as a Brahmana, yeah, like that also, Dakshina, stuff like that. And that's how you make your living. But as a Brahmana, he was suggesting that all things are pure, which we maybe don't appreciate in this current day and age, but it's really radical. Like at that time, for him to say that, like, no, wine is not impure, meat is not impure, sexual relations, like with certain members of certain caste, is not impure. And then on the caste topic, we get something really radical too. He says something profound. He says, though the fire that is in the Brahmana's house is essentially the same fire that is in the funeral pyre or in the Shudra's house, the Chandala's house. Now you have to remember, fire in the Indian context is very important. You have to purify the fire before you can make oblations into it. You know, some of you have seen us perform the homas, and while we're doing homas, there are mantras to purify the fire. And God forbid you use a fire that's impure already, like a funeral pyre. The fire in the cremation ground is not to be used for oblations to certain deities. And now this is where it gets interesting. The fire is essentially the same though, right? Like in terms of its physics, its physicality, like the same fire is there in the Brahmana's house. It gives light, it burns. Does it not act like fire in the Brahmana's house? Does it not also act like fire when it's used to cremate your uncle? Both are still essentially fire. So Somananda says the property of fire, the dharma of fire, remains the same whether or not that fire is in the Brahmana's house or in the Shudra's house. You know, and now the thing you have to understand here is that fire is also a metaphor. Like a lot of these masters were using language with a lot of double entendre. So they say one thing, but they mean something much deeper. That's why it's important when we study these texts, not just to read them, but to have commentary on them. So here's what Somananda says. He says, the fire in the Brahmana's house is not different from the fire in the Shudra's house, right? But here's the crazy thing. This is so profound. He says, fire, he doesn't say this, but you know that fire means consciousness. Fire essentially is a metaphor in the Indian spiritual tradition for consciousness, for the self. And the house is another metaphor for the body. So the fire in the Brahmana's house both refers to the physical fire in the physical location in which a Brahmana and his family lives, but it also refers to the consciousness that is within, as it were, the Brahmana's body. So who the Brahmana is essentially and who the Chandala, the Shudra is essentially, is the same. And so Somananda dismisses caste. which is something you'll find is consistent in the Kaula world. So when you go to Shankara, he might not teach you Advaita Vedanta unless you are a Brahmin male. You have to be a Brahmana in order to learn Advaita Vedanta because it's Vedanta. It's rooted in a Vedic kind of culture. Whereas the Tantric tradition was notorious for initiating people who weren't in the higher castes. So initiating outcasts, chandalas, and whatnot. So much so that Ramanuja, in the beginning of his Sri Bhashya, says, "Look at these Shaivas. They're all initiating Shudras and whatnot. How terrible!" Because it's unconscionable, that a Shaiva that someone like Somananda would not care about caste like that. So the lack of caste distinctions, the lack of idea around purity and impurity, these are all very Kaula forms of spirituality. And not only that, the engagement with the world as divine. Since the world is no longer impure, the world can be re-engaged with as divine. That's a distinctly Kaula orientation, finding God in the world as the world through like eating chocolate cake and running and having orgasms and all of that. Seeing that as divine is something that maybe arguably Somananda is one of the first to articulate philosophically. So you see that in the Vijnana Bhairava. The Vijnana Bhairava has a very strong Kaula leaning insofar as it alchemizes mundane, ordinary experiences into divine experiences based on its theory that everything is pure because everything is Shiva, based on the idea of its Advaita, a radical kind of Advaita. And in Vijnana Bhairava, verse 105, you see clearly the claim that Somananda stakes his whole philosophy on. Even pots and other inanimate objects are conscious in the way that I am conscious, in that they are endowed with willing, knowing, and doing. So this idea, that's in Somananda. But he's writing in a very scriptural way. So Somananda is drawing from the Vijnana Bhairava. He's obviously drawing from the Malini Vijayo Taro Tantra. That's one of the main texts of the Trika tradition, which the dualist Shaivas reject. They don't find this text authoritative, but it's one of the main texts for the Trikas, the non-dual goddess worshippers known as the Trikas. And undoubtedly, Somananda has some access to Kalikula, Shataka, otherwise known as the Devi Shataka. Like he has access to these Krama texts, Kali Kula texts. So there's this like Kali Krama transmission, there's the Trika transmission, and obviously there's the whole Vijnana Bhairava thing, and it's all coming into Somananda. But again, you have to remember he's writing for a smaller audience. He's writing for a group of tantric initiates, probably, and therefore he takes his liberties. That's why he's able to be so radical, and he quotes entirely from the Tantras even. And Utpala Deva is now commenting on that Shiva Drishti. It's called the Pada Sangati, and it's also known as the the Shiva Drishti Vritti. And Utpala Deva is commenting on the Shiva Drishti, and he too is speaking for a very small audience. And he says so. Utpala Deva in his Vritti says, I am composing this Vritti for my son and for my son's friend. Isn't that so sweet? It's like Somananda, Utpala Deva's guru, composes a text expressing the most radical and arguably most transgressive form of non-duality ever, a non-duality of maximal acceptance of divinity in the world as the world, and he's presenting it in his commentary to his son, who is trying to help teach the text, and that's so beautiful. Just think of like the guru tradition as being something familial also. A father wants to teach his son what his guru taught him, and so he composes this text. And not just his son and his son's friend. So the thing to note though is that Utpala Deva is a little more famous than Somananda. Somananda's Shiva Drishti had a very important effect. It's one of the most important texts, one of the foundational texts of the lineage, and Somananda's guru is his father. And whose father's father up 15 generations goes back to none other than Trayambaka, the one to whom Shiva gave non-dual knowledge, or to whom Durvasas gave non-dual knowledge. So Somananda's lineage is so important because it literally goes right back up to Shiva, and you can trace it. Like you can actually trace Somananda's fathers like Arunaditya, like Ananda, Somananda and his father Ananda and Arunaditya and all the other Adityas, all the way up to none other than Trayambaka, who might have lived in Maharashtra actually. So Somananda's father or father's father might have moved into Kashmir, Srinagar, from some other place, probably Maharashtra. It's hard to say. But in any case, his father's father, up to 15 generations, is none other than the one to whom Shiva allegedly gave the non-dual transmission, Trayambaka, or Durvasas gave this transmission to Trayambaka. So Somananda is very important. His lineage is very important. And arguably his text is the most important because unlike the Shiva Sutra or the Spandakarika, which can be seen as foundational texts in the tradition, his text is philosophical. It's an attempt to present the whole thing as a system, not just as a series of yogic and mystical claims. So Somananda gives the Shiva Drishti, and Utpala Deva, who is Somananda's disciple, wants to teach it to his son. So he composes the Shiva Drishti Vritti. But a big part of Utpaladeva's Shiva Drishta Vritti, Shiva Drishti Vritti, is pointing back to his main text, the Ishvara Pratyabhigya Karika. This is Utpaladeva's masterpiece. Utpaladeva also has some devotional stuff, like the Shiva Sutravali, which is regularly chanted all over India, and especially in Kashmir, even to this day. And it's a beautiful text where at the end, Utpaladeva says one of my favorite lines ever, where he says, like, "Oh Lord, I only have one prayer left for you. I only have one prayer, actually. And my prayer is that I can continually drink the liquor of thy devotion, chanting thy name, dancing mad with joy in the cremation ground with my friends, the nine ghosts." It's a remarkable line. And that's the devotional side of Utpaladeva. He also wrote a text called Ishvara Siddhi, where he presents another idea that's very favorite for me. The idea is that, like, even if duality is ignorance, and if non-duality is knowledge, then you can say knowledge is like a burning firebrand and ignorance is like a dark room. It's in duality that it's in duality that non-duality is best expressed. Just like it's in a dark room that a burning firebrand shines the brightest. What a beautiful and stunning idea in defense of the world and of being in the world and of being in duality. Anyway, that aside, he writes a lot of stuff. He's a very devotional author, but his main text is the Ishvara Pratyabhigya Karika. Now, the Karika is for a much wider audience. So, one thing to note is that what Utpaladeva does in his Karika is speak in a more philosophical and a more conventionally accepted language than Somananda's more mystical and like eccentric text. So Utpaladeva will use the language of the grammarians, which Somananda rejects. So Utpaladeva quotes doesn't quote, but does he quote? I think. But he uses the Vakpadiya of Bhatrhari most favorably. Whereas Somananda has real hang-ups with Bhatrhari and the grammarians and whatnot. So not only that, but you see Utpaladeva use terms like Prakasha and Vimarsha. These terms, Prakasha and Vimarsha, aren't native to the tradition, you know. They come from the Shabda Brahma Vada school. They come from Panini and Bhatrhari and whatnot. So those terms are imported into the non-dual Shaiva tradition from the grammarian tradition. Somananda didn't like this word, Prakasha, Vimarsha. He didn't have any use for those words. You know, because it already sets up a kind of duality. Once you say Prakasha, Vimarsha, you kind of say that Vimarsha is a sort of other almost, even though it's included in Prakasha. There's a subtle trace of duality in this idea of Prakasha and Vimarsha. And because Somananda is a strict non-dualist, he is like a die-hard, uncompromising Advaitin, he rejects anything that even smacks of duality, which even has a hint of duality. So he didn't use Prakasha or Vimarsha. Not only that, he didn't like the grammarian school because it was too dualistic. Even though they weren't, by the way, the grammarian school were non-dualists, but he felt like the word pashanti, seeing, implies some seen object. So if Shiva is pashanti, pashanti is a feminine noun, so therefore it would be like the goddess. If the goddess sees, then there must be something that the goddess sees. This is too Advaitic, not too Dvaitic for Somananda. So he rejects Bhatrhari and the grammarians. He wouldn't have used terms like Prakasha and Vimarsha. But why does Utpaladeva do that? Utpaladeva arguably does that because the grammarians are very popular. And by using the language of the grammarians, he can reinterpret that language along Shaiva non-dual lines and thereby present this idea to a wider audience by using language that would have already been familiar to them. Not only that, Utpaladeva wholeheartedly acknowledges Maya, although he redefines it in a different way. It's more like Abheda Akyati. Abheda Akyati is very different from Agyana or Avidya, but in any case, it's still Maya. I mean, like, he's still using the word Maya, and Abhinavagupta also uses the word Maya. Somananda, absolutely silent on this Maya stuff. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't use any word like Maya. He honestly doesn't think there's such a thing as Maya. And you know what? Do you know where else you won't find the word Maya? The Upanishads. Nowhere in the Upanishads is the word Maya used. It's something that uniquely arises with Shankara. So the idea that there's something called ignorance or illusion or something that contracts us, like, that's conspicuously absent in Somananda. Which of course leads to a series of philosophical problems like the one I sketched out earlier. Like, why, if it is the case that I'm Shiva, why don't I feel like it? Or why, if everything is one, why does it appear that things are distinct and discrete from one another? These are the philosophical problems that the word Maya is hoping to solve. But with the solution comes also a sense of purity and impurity, which of course the Shaiva non-dual tradition rejects. The only impurity is thinking there is impurity, for instance. So, but Utpaladeva, knowing this and subscribing to this view, is still willing to use the word Maya. Nyaya. He's still willing to use words like prakasha and vimarsha. He's still willing to engage with the grammarians and whatnot, and he's willing to engage with the Vijnanavadins, the Buddhists, and a Buddhist epistemologist at the time. He's willing to engage with a wider audience because his text is indeed for a wider audience. Which changes a lot, actually. It makes the text more relatable, but it also makes it less, like, arguably esoteric and radical, which is fine. It has drawbacks and benefits. So Utpaladeva presents his text, but it's arguably Abhinavagupta who's going to be the most famous in this tradition. Somananda is so important, but not that famous. He's pretty indie, you know. And then Utpaladeva is slightly more famous and very revered, and his texts have a wider audience, but nowhere near as famous as Abhinavagupta. Abhinavagupta is Utpaladeva's disciple's disciple, and Abhinavagupta's texts are so far-ranging. And what I love about Abhinavagupta is he has really esoteric stuff meant only for tantric initiates. But he also presents this stuff in a way that's digestible and palatable by the widest possible audience. So like I've said before, when Abhinavagupta is talking to the public, he's using the word Ishvara, which is a word for God that the public is very familiar with. When he's talking to Shaivas, he'll use the word Shiva or Shiva. When he's talking to Tantrics, he'll use the word Bhairava. Not always, but often. And when he's talking to the nearest and dearest, his closest initiates, he might use the word Kali. In fact, Anakya is probably the word that he would use for Kali. So the Krama or the Kalikula is at the heart of this Shaiva tradition, and around it is the Trika, which is slightly equally esoteric, arguably, is the Krama, and around that is the Tantric tradition as a whole, and around that is the Shaiva tradition as a whole, and around that is the whole Sanatana Dharma context. So you can see it as a kind of mandala or a kind of sacred geometric diagram where each layer takes you deeper and deeper and deeper into the esoteric heart of the tradition, and the beating, pulsating, throbbing heart of this entire tantric transmission is Kali. Abhinavagupta calls her Anakya, the goddess. In fact, Abhinavagupta gives a verse. He says, Shiva Swabhavaha Iti Shakti. The goddess, Shakti, is the essence of Shiva. That's the main thing we've come here to learn. We've come here to learn about Kali. But look, Kali, how secret she is. Only now we can, like, you know, metal bands can put her picture on the cover of their albums and sell their albums. But even then, their albums get banned sometimes. Right? There are like Icelandic metal bands who can't send their lecture. Yeah, good. So not lecture. They can't send their album anywhere because the cover is too spicy. Kali is too spicy. You guys, we got banned on YouTube for a thumbnail of Kali. So even in 2025, like, it's still kind of edgy. It's still too much for most of society, you know. And rightly so, because she represents the unbridled feminine power, like a feminine power that is totally established in its sexual power, in its violence, in its ferocity, and in its inclusion. Because the kind of love that Kali has is an unconditional love that doesn't play by the rules of institutions and titles and whatnot. It doesn't play by the rules of pure, impure, of Brahmanical standards, of codes of conduct or anything, nothing like that. The love of Kali is so all-inclusive that it includes all aspects of our being, including those that are spiritually problematic. So naturally then, you have to be careful who you present Kali to, because otherwise they might freak out and either, in India's case, censor you, or in the case of other countries, kill you maybe. There's some religious violence in other countries, and that's why Sufis and Christian mystics had to be so secret, and Freemasons and whatnot, they had to be so secret. In India, you won't be killed for saying something radical, but no one will read your book. That's one thing. That's the worst thing that can happen to you, arguably. And Somananda didn't care. He didn't care that no one would read his book because he wasn't writing for everybody. He was writing for a select group of people. But Abhinavagupta did want to present this material to a wider audience without compromising the esoteric stuff. He was still willing to teach to a wider audience, and that's why we get so much variety, such diversity in text. He was prolific. He spent his whole life composing text. So I just want to take a moment now to acknowledge the Paramarthasara and how it fits into all of this. The Paramarthasara to me is so genius because it's so concise and it's meant for a public audience. You can see the trend of sort of reclaiming terms that would be common in other traditions, popular traditions, and reinterpreting them along Shaiva lines. So here Abhinavagupta just comes clean and tells you that's exactly what he's going to do. He takes a text, which is already very popular, called the Adharakarikas, written by Patanjali, the very, very popular Yoga Sutra author. He takes that text and he says, now I'm going to recast it along the lines of Shaiva Shasana, along the lines of Shaiva or Tantric non-duality. He tells you. And he's going to use all these terms that you're familiar with, like the rope snake analogy from Shankara, like this idea of like the Sankhyan 24 tattvas. Like he's going to take all this stuff that you already know about, and then he's going to lead you from there to something deeper and more profound. He's gonna take the milk and give you some yogurt or something like that, you know. So the argument is like all of this stuff is there. It just requires someone like Abhinavagupta to bring it out, to make it manifest. And that to me, that's the sign of a great teacher. A great teacher is not necessarily a preacher. You know, a preacher professes from the platform what they want you to believe is true. But that's not what a teacher does. A teacher doesn't just say stuff and expect you to understand it and believe it. The teacher says the exact thing that you need to hear based on what you know in order to get you to the next stage of your development and understanding relative to you and to what would be nourishing to you. So teaching is almost always individual. It's almost always about the student and the need of that student at that time. And in this sense, Abhinavagupta was one of the best teachers. You can see it in Utpala Deva too. You know how he was writing the vritti for his son. How beautiful, right? Like that he wanted to teach his son Somananda's very difficult text, the Shiva Drishti. So he wrote a vritti just for his son, and we get to benefit from it. How lucky. It's like a tantra. Lord Shiva is talking to Parvati, and we just happen to be there, and so we can listen to what they're saying to each other. Similarly, Utpala Deva, Shiva himself is speaking to his son, and because he wrote it all down, it's recorded. We have it. The Shiva, not the whole thing, by the way. Only 4 chapters are available. The rest is missing. 5, 6, and 7. We lost it. We don't know where it is. But the first 4 chapters, chapters 1 through 4, there's the vritti, I think. Okay, so there's Somananda, there's Utpaladeva, there's Abhinavagupta, of course, and then Shemaraja and Jayaratta, and there's like a whole host of authors. And of course, there's Maheshwarananda in Chidambaram temple in Tamil Nadu, who's composing all these important, like, you know, Shritikanta and Maheshwarananda, they're composing Maharta texts. You know, arguably, if I just may like be so bold, let me just say it. I think the essence of the tradition is the Maharta. If I can, that might sound like a sectarian claim, but this is the Kali Kula school, but in its most extreme. It's like so extreme. It's like Kali, but Kali who devours even her own husband or something. Yeah, Shri Mas, sure. Oh, Jai Ma. Wow, Shri, you are a beautiful artist. Do you see in the chat? Shri Ma is showing. She sketched. Wow, this is so beautiful, Ma. Look at that. Do you see it? Shiva and Ma in Yamala in ecstatic union. Jai Ma. So beautiful. Jai Ma. Har Har Mahadev. Jai Ma. So pretty. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Ma. Jai Ma. Wow. Yeah, it's profound. It's like really good. I'm gonna like keep looking at it actually. I like it a lot. But what's the idea here is that there is this essence to the tradition. We can say it's Kali, but by the way, Kali can be understood in many different ways. The Kaula understanding of Kali involves a circuit of 12 Kalis. Whereas the Maharta understanding of Kali involves a 13th Kali who devours the 12. So it's like this question of pantheism versus panentheism, maybe, or something like that. And Somananda definitely leans more towards the pantheistic kind of thing, whereas Utpala and Abhinavagupta might lean towards more the panentheistic thing. And those terms, pantheistic, panentheistic, this analysis of Somananda, a lot of that I have to credit the author John Nemec for. So I think it was him who like pointed out that Somananda might be more pantheistic, whereas Utpaladeva might be more panentheistic. You know, and we tend to take a more panentheistic approach in our community, using Utpala and Abhinavagupta primarily. But I'm indebted to the scholar John Nemec for presenting this idea that, like, actually, well, Somananda might just be a pantheist. He might just think there's literally the world and God is literally that world. There's no difference really between Shiva and the world. There's no transcendent reality beyond the world that is called God. Because to posit one would be to imply some kind of duality, you know, which Somananda is avowedly against. So, having said that, it's nice to see all these different streams of tradition and the differences. And this is the claim that I really, really want to double down on. The differences just have to do with audience, I think. It's not that they're teaching different things. They're teaching the same thing, but using different words to address different audiences at different stages of their journey. So just because we're saying, oh, Kali is at the heart of the Shaiva Tantra tradition, Kali or Maharta, the Maharta interpretation of the Kali is at the very center. Just because we're saying that doesn't mean it's better. You know, because if you went straight to the Kali stuff, maybe it wouldn't work for you. Maybe for someone, the Shaiva Siddhanta stuff is the best. Although you could say that's a little bit further out. For some people, the Charvaka school is the best. I can think of so many people in my life right now for whom the Charvaka philosophy is the best. You know, Charvaka philosophy is just the world is real, Party on Wayne, party on Garth. Wayne's World, party time. Just have fun. The world is only for fun. It's only for pleasure. There's no such thing as soul. There's no such thing as God. There's no such thing as heaven. There's like nothing to live for but here and now and pleasure. It's like YOLO philosophy, you know? And they're saying like if you have to go on credit in order to get pleasure, go on credit. Don't worry about it. If you have to destroy the environment, also don't worry about it. You won't reincarnate to have to deal with the consequences. It's like the most materialist form of philosophy. It's almost satire. But you can take it seriously. Some people in the world will really benefit from this because they just need to like enjoy their life. They need to discover who they are, which might involve them changing their ideas around food and sexuality and work and all these things that keep them trapped. They need to live their life, and Charvaka might empower them to do so. And you saw that in Europe, right? Once all the European thinkers got free of the Catholic Church, you saw a sort of renaissance of thinking because they just needed some immanence-oriented materialism to save them from the tyrannical transcendentalism of the churches that were there. You know, so Charvaka is important, but it can't give us everything. It's on the outer skirts of the mandala. And from Charvaka, you can go into Sankhya. From Sankhya, you go yoga. Like you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And you could say, in this tantric world, Kali is the pulsating, throbbing center, which doesn't mean she's better, but also doesn't mean she's different. So she's equally present in the Charvaka, in the Bhupura, as she is in the um, Bindu. So one thing to point out is that the Bindu and the Bhupura, I'm using the imagery of the yantra. So if you look at the yantra here, here's the Kali yantra. The Bindu is at the very center, but then there are these four gates. There's like a lot of other stuff going on. But the important thing to remember is that like the whole thing is Kali. The Bhupura, which is like, you know, Ganesh and Vatuka and Kshetrapala and Yoginis and whatnot, the Bhupura is as much Kali as the Ashtamatrikas or the 64 yoginis are Kali. As much Kali as the 15 or 12 or 13 Kalis are Kali. Like everything is equally Kali, but pulsating at different levels of expression, different levels of emanation or manifestation. So that being said, the thing to point out here most importantly, is that there are differences between Somananda and Utpaladeva. Scholars like Noli and Torella have really explored like the relationship between these traditions and Vijnanavad in Buddhism and Bhatrahari's grammarian stuff. But clearly there are like lots of different traditions that are pouring their streams into one another. Somananda is different from Utpala. Utpala is different from Abhinavagupta. But there's a common thread that runs through all of them. The reason they're different is because they're teaching the same thing at different times to different audiences. It is the same thing though. So the thing to point out is when Abhinava uses the word Ishvara, when he uses the word Shiva, when he uses the word Bhairava, or when he uses the word Kali, he's literally talking about the same reality, but presenting it on different levels of esoterica. Okay, and therefore, I just want to not dispel, but interact with this idea, you know, like that we find in the modern tantric world today, where it's like, oh, to get to Kali, you have to get through Bhairava, but they mean that in a more like devotional sense. So they'll be like, oh, you have to do Bhairava Japa, and until you do Bhairava Japa, then you won't be able to get to Kali. That's all good, by the way. This tradition is wholly favorable to this more polytheistic kind of Hinduism, because this is a kind of Hinduism. I'm not knocking it. It's a kind of Hinduism that regards each and every one of these deities as like Justice League superheroes or something, and they each have a specific power and character, and it's like you choose one and you like do sadhana for that one, and then that one gives you the siddhi and you can do that one. Like there's a kind of like Justice League version of Hinduism, you know. And there the differences are more explicitly they're more pronounced. They're more important. So it's like, oh, this japa, do that. And then through Bhairava, you can get Kali. Like that. Bhairava is seen as a different deity than Kali. And Kali is seen as different from Lalita Tripura Sundari, who is seen as different from, say, Durga. So like people are like, oh, I want to worship Durga. Why do I have a Kali mantra? Or I want to worship this deity. Why do I have a mantra for that deity? Like that's a good and valid form of Hinduism. That's a perfectly fine approach. This is just not that. This is talking about things arguably on a different I don't want to say a more refined level, lest we become sectarian. Not like that. From a different approach. So just call it different. Not better or worse, just different. Here we're talking about reality as pure consciousness, and that consciousness we call Kali when we're speaking most esoterically. But when speaking publicly, we can call it God or Shiva or whatever we want, you know. So the name doesn't matter, but it also does matter because it depends. Each name carries it with a certain connotation. So I want to come back to Abhinavagupta and say that the Paramartha Sara is really genius because it's him being his most public facing. He's taking a text that is very well known and reinterpreting it along non-dual Shaiva lines. But while he does that, he's presenting little clues, as it were, to take you deeper and deeper and deeper into the tradition. So anybody can take the text and read it and get what they need out of it, I think, at different levels of their journey, which makes this text a very living text to me. It feels like the text is still alive and its author, Abhinavagupta, is still there, helping us understand the text according to our own capacity. So because we've taken about a 3 week or so hiatus, it would be nice now for me to just very briefly walk you through what's happened in the text so far. And then we can return, we can resume our discussion of like sentience and insentience and individuals. And it's a very difficult, thorny subject. Why is Shiva appearing as an individual? What's the relationship between Jiva and Shiva? That's the part of the text we're on now. But prior to this discussion, the first thing we learned from Abhinavagupta is this: Param Parastam Gahanat Anadim. And this idea that there is this reality, param parastam gahanadanadim ekam nivishtam bahuda guhasu sarvalayam sarvacharacharastam tvameva shambhu sharanam prabhade. So this is a mangala charana, it's a mangala shloka, it's just an invocation of the guru, it's praising God and guru in order to invoke auspiciousness before beginning the text. But as you know, these should not be ignored, because like I was saying for 4 or 5 lectures in the beginning of this series, the invocatory verse usually contains within it the seed of the whole text. That is the brilliance of these Sanskrit masters, Sanskrit language masters, and these tantric masters, that they use their language to express more than what is just obviously said. So here we know the first word is para. Para means supreme. So parama means supreme, but obviously it has the connotation of para. So para is the supreme goddess of the Trika. She is the central deity of the Purvamnaya, the Trika system, which Abhinavagupta is extremely loyal to. So he uses the Trika. In fact, his own tradition, he calls it the Anuttara Trika. His own formulation of Tantra, his interpretation, he calls Anuttara Trika. Which again, Anuttara Trika is, it might be different from Somananda's thing. There are like differences. So it's important to point that out. Sometimes people are so glib. They just treat this, there's a lot. Okay, you know what? I'll just put it on the recording. I'll say this. It's probably not fair to say that my guru is the only person in the world who can give initiations into non-dual Shaivism. I mean, the fact that my guru alone is a Shaiva and that there are no other Shaiva gurus available, I think is unlikely. It might be true, but it's unlikely. It's unlikely that the tradition ends when your guru passes away. Like, there are other gurus who are practicing that tradition who can also give initiation. And if it is indeed true that my guru is the only one who can give initiations into this particular tradition, then that dismisses the pan-Indian tradition, because it's not just there in one region. This tradition of Tantra, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, is all over. Like Maheshwarananda was composing his Mahartha text in Chidambaram, and there are great authors like Bhaskara Raya and others who are composing commentaries on Yogini Hridaya and other very important Sri Vidya texts, in other regions in India. Sri Vidya has developed so much in South India. Like, you can't just say there's one specific region in India where these traditions live and die. And when your particular teacher dies, then somehow the lineage is just gone. Even if we were to say that it's only there in that region, which we can't say because it's all over India and now all over the world, but even if it was just in that region, if you say your guru is the only one who can give initiation into this lineage, then you're dismissing all the other gurus who are practicing it, all the other people in that region alone who are members of this tradition. Wasn't your guru part of a tradition? And didn't your guru have guru bhais, guru bhaginis, disciples, fellow disciples? And didn't your guru have a guru who also had guru bhais and guru bhaginis, who also had a guru who also had guru bhais and guru bhaginis? So this idea that like only my guru can give you initiation into this lineage, and now that my guru is gone, you'll never get initiations into this dead tradition, is something that only a Western scholar can say. Because it's not true in India. It's just the idea is that in India, these traditions are very well kept up. They're much alive. So that's my joke. It's like, if really the people who could teach non-dual Tantra are all gone, then what about Acharya Stanishwar Timalsana? Like, what a genuine and authentic representation of this tradition in this country, even teaching in Long Island. Like, what about him and what about his Sangha? Is his Nepali, Kaubjika, like Sarvamnaya tradition suddenly invalid because he didn't grow up in Kashmir, because he's not the one teacher who's able to give? So that's one problem. The second problem is this idea that Indians don't know what they're doing. It's a pervasive idea in Western academia. It's like, we know Sanskrit better than the Indians on the subcontinent know Sanskrit. And not only that, we're smarter because we have fancy universities. So we understand the text that they wrote better than them. And so if you want to learn non-dual Shaivism, don't learn from Indians. Come and learn from Western scholars, because we have the material. We are the only ones who have the texts. They don't even have the text. We as academics have access to the actual manuscripts. And not only do we have the manuscripts, we are able to translate. And by the way, it's not just about knowing Sanskrit. There's also a whole, it's true, there is a whole sequence and process to translating manuscripts. You have to compare. Some of them are not in Devanagari. Some of them are in Sharada script. Some of them are in Malayali scripts like Grantha. Like, you have to know OCRs and how to take the manuscript and with the OCR digitalize it and make sure there are no gaps between the manuscript. And often a lot of these manuscripts are corrupted, so you need like manuscript T from this German university and manuscript L from this American university and manuscript H from this other university. And there's obviously a lot of academic work. I don't mean to downplay any of that. And maybe some of that academic work is not available to the traditional Indian scholar within the context of a Gurukula. Fine, that's perfectly fine. But assuming that these manuscripts have been digitalized and made available, the idea that only certain people know how to read them and know how to practice them is, I think, problematic. The idea that we need to recreate traditions that are no longer around is also, I think, problematic. These traditions live and breathe. They're pulsating, vibrant traditions. They've changed their forms, but that doesn't mean they're dead. To say that they are dead is to read a text from 950 AD and to not take into consideration all the ways that that teaching has evolved in India since then. If you take India out of the picture and you forget about the rest of Shaivism and the rest of Shaktism and the rest of like the subcontinent and you stay with the text in 950, only then are you able to make claims like, oh, this tradition is dead and we as a community are uniquely restoring it. So for $2,000, you can come to the workshop and you can learn something that even these like Indian priests don't know. So the dominant view is that these just are priests, they don't know anything. They just like wave their incense and they wave their lamp and they do the rituals, but they don't even know the meaning of their own rituals. Most of them don't even know Sanskrit. And the fact that we privilege Sanskrit is also problematic because many of these tantras, like much of the tantras that I grew up with, are transmitted in um, Tamil. Do you know? Isn't that interesting? There's like Tamil stuff. Okay, that's a good question, Sarvateshwara. Let's get Saraswati Ishvara. I was thinking Sarvata Ishvara. No, it's Sarasvateshwara. So the Lord of Saraswati. I see, Sarasvateshwara. Jayama, Jayama. Yeah, let's talk about it. So in the Discord, a lot of things the principles that we have in our community. But yeah, in the Q&A, let's talk about it. But I just like now want to flag it. This idea that there are only certain teachers who can teach certain lineages is a kind of gatekeeping, I think. And I think it ignores the fact that the tradition is broad and rich and alive, and these commentarial traditions exist still. And there are many people who are still existing, living masters of traditions. And so we don't have to feel like, oh, there's only a certain, like, I think this is the problem. No one community can claim to have a monopoly or hegemony on truth. That's important to point out because every religion claims this. Like Christianity claims that their way is the one way, the true way. Never mind that there are 45,000 different sects of Christianity all around the world. The claim is that our way is the true way. Islam claims it, and many forms of Hinduism claim it too. Like Gaudiya Vaishnavas might claim it, although in a more inclusivist and less like exclusivist way. But like everyone seems to think that their community is the only community that has a monopoly on truth, or not only that, a monopoly on a certain culture, a certain tradition. So when it comes to non-dual Shaivism, to say that our community has a monopoly on it, I think is a kind of gatekeeping, which of course is very like profitable in terms of like saying to people, like if you want to learn this stuff, you have to come here to learn it because no one else can teach it to you. They don't have the manuscripts, they don't have the manuscript deciphering ability, they don't have the Sanskrit, they just don't have the understanding and the subtlety to practice these things. And also what they're doing is not this. This thing is unique, it's dead, and we're reviving it, and they're not. So that becomes possible. And secondly, it's problematic to call it Kashmir Shaivism because I think it's disrespectful to Kashmir itself. There's so much in Kashmir. There are like Narasingha traditions in Kashmir. There's Shaiva Siddhanta in Kashmir. There's such a flourishing of Shaiva Siddhanta in Kashmir that to say that Kashmir Shaivism just means the Trika, the Krama, the Kaula, just to say that Pratya, Bigya, and Spanda alone is representative of Kashmir Shaivism is not only disrespectful to Kashmir, it's disrespectful to Shaivism. Because you could say Shaivism, to pigeonhole it into this like non-dual interpretation, it dismisses all the Shaiva Siddhanta stuff, which you can just then say oh, it's dualistic, it's like lowly or something. But it's wonderful stuff. Like if we were to look at the Raurava Agama, there's a Maikandar Siddhar part of that, which is called the Shiva Jnana Bodha, which we've studied together some time ago. Like, that's a beautiful text. And it can be interpreted non-dualistically. So it's true, certain traditions will accept certain tantras and not others. Like Shaiva Siddhanta accepts about 18, whereas the Raudra Agamas might accept about like 10 or 11, and then the non-dual Shaivas might accept 64, Malini Vijayataro Tantra, Trishuro Bhairava Tantra, which is lost, Jayadrata Devya Yamala Tantra, which is also lost, Jayarata Yamala Tantra, which we have as Tantra Raja Tantra. So there's also, it's called Tantra Raj. But anyway, like you can accept some Tantras, reject some Tantras, that's fine and all. But to say that Kashmir Shaivism just means that tradition which accepts only a select number of Tantras is disrespectful to the region because Kashmir has so much more than that. But it's disrespectful to Shaivism because it says that Shaivism is just this. Kashmir Shaivism isn't just this. It's Shaiva Siddhanta also. It's other forms of qualified non-dual Shaivism also. So Shaivism is vast and beautiful, and its streams are many. And so I think when Abhinavagupta is composing this work, Paramarthasaras, he's engaging a wider audience. And so the reason for this whole rant, I think, it's respectfully and lovingly to say that like, no, this is a robust and beautiful tradition which has been kept alive by not only Pandits in Kashmir. Of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that Pandits in Kashmir were able to keep these manuscripts alive during years and years, decades of centuries almost of Mughal rule, right? Like being able to like during that time of religious persecution when these texts were being burned for being heretical, these Panditas, these Brahmin families risked their lives to maintain this tradition. That should be remembered. And the tradition is vast. It's got all these various streams. And so there are all these different streams of Shaivism. And what Abhinavagupta seems to be doing is he's engaging Shaiva Siddhanta material. Utpaladeva and Somananda, they quote Shaiva Siddhanta texts quite favorably, except they sometimes reinterpret them or redirect them towards a more non-dual interpretation. Like, for instance, Kshema Raja's interpretation of the Shwachanda Bhairava Tantra, which is a famous Tantra in Kashmir, very popular amongst Kashmiri Brahmins, engaging a big part of the Shaiva Siddhanta world. So to engage them, he uses that text and comments upon it along non-dual lines. So there are all these differences, right? And I think it's very sad if we just take one thing and say this is the whole thing. It causes us to miss out on all the other really cool stuff there. Yan, the answer is yes. Jai Ma. But Yan is asking, is the coffee mug conscious? Anyway, let me wrap up in just a few moments and get to that juicy part. But the point I want to make now is that the Paramarthasara, it's a short text, it's a concise text, it's a reinterpretation of like the famous text called the Adarakarakas attributed to Patanjali, and therefore it's accessing a very wide audience. So Abhinavagupta is going to use words that are familiar with a wider audience, maybe even metaphors and examples that are familiar to them, but he's going to slightly and subtly reinterpret them and slowly draw us into deeper and deeper understandings of this tradition, which he calls Anutaratrika, which actually contains elements of Pratyabhigya, Spanda, Krama, and Kalikula and whatnot. Krama is a form of Kalikula. Okay, so having said all of that, here's the first thing that we get from the text. And this is why this makes it a very good introduction to Tantra. But I just want to point out now that this is a very different approach to the one that's like more common, like the more popular, like Justice League, polytheistic Hindu thing. I don't mean to make fun of it. It's also pretty cool. But it's a different way of looking at things. Like each deity is distinct. No, now we're looking at consciousness itself. This is a non-dual approach, arguably. So looking at consciousness itself, the names are many, the reality is one. So coming to Abhinavagupta now in the Paramarthasara, the first thing we get is Param Parastam Gahanad Anadim. So the name Para, obviously Param means supreme, Parama, Parameshvara and whatnot, but Para refers to this goddess in the Trika, the central deity of the Trika. By the way, these are deities, they're goddesses, Para, and Apara, but Abhinavagupta reinterprets them as principles. And even Somananda does this. He reinterprets them as the Shakti Traya, Icha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti. So the Shakti Traya are no longer three goddesses that are part of a tradition. Now, there are three powers that rest within Śiva. So the goddesses are now seen as powers, indistinguishable from Śiva, and kind of made more abstract, more non-dual, if you will. Anyway, so we have Para, and Apara. And Para is the one name that encompasses all three. Para. So he says Param Parastham. She's Stha, established in the supreme. So Para, the supreme deity, is established in the absolute non-dual reality. Para Parastham. Gahanad. She's beyond the Gahana, the abyss. Or void or depth, the forest of transmigratory existence. She's Anadim, she's beginningless. Gahanad Anadim. She's Ekam, non-dual. She's eternal. And more importantly, she is manifesting herself in the hearts of all beings. So she is your very own essence nature. All beings have this essence. Sarvam Sarvatmakam, Sarvam Shivatmakam. All things are essentially Śiva, and this Śiva is that supreme goddess who abides beyond the forest of transmigration, who is beginningless and endless, who is non-dual and eternal. So this goddess, she abides in all beings, but she manifests differently. So within her, within the mirror of consciousness, shines non-differently, all sorts of new combinations. So this is not an illusion, this is art. The idea is that she can manifest such variegated forms without ever losing her pristine non-duality. And she is the ground in which all things rest. And the claim here is that she is equally present in the moving and unmoving. Sarva chara charastam. So sarva chara charastam. Chara means to move, achara, and achara means to not move. So the ones who move and the ones who don't move, meaning the ones who are sentient and the ones who aren't, she is equally present in them both. So there's this idea of soul, and a human is in-souled. An animal might not be. In the Christian world, animals don't have souls, right? But you could argue even, sometimes you could say animal has an animal soul, human has a human soul, plant has a plant soul, but they're all in-souled because they're jivas. The rock has no soul. It's not a jiva. Here it's saying, no, everything is the goddess. Everything is in-souled in a way. That's already said in the first verse. Param parastam gahana danadim ekam nivishtam Bahuda Guhasu. She's in the Guha, the heart caves of the many. She's Nivishta, abiding there. Bahuda Guhasu. Sarvalayam Sarvachara Charastam. She is all pervasively present in all things, as all things. She is the ground of all things, and she is my Guru. So, as a Mangala Shloka, obviously, he's going to praise his Guru, and he's saying, Tvameva Shambhu Sharanam Prapadye. He's praising his Guru. Now, I want to close with another invocation to the Guru that Abhinava Gupta gives us in the Tantra Sara. But before I do that, let's just come back to this text and let me sketch it out for you real quick. So, the next thing that we get is this idea of what the text is. So, in verses 2 and 3, so verse 1 is this profound Mangala Shloka. Verse 2 and 3 is, what do you call it? Like an explanation of the text. It's called the Shastravatara. Like, where does this text come from? So he explains the Adhara Karaka, but he also explains the guru-student relationship. So he explains that a student, a worthy student who desires the highest knowledge, has approached Adhara, Bhagavan Adhara, the Lord Adhara, meaning Adishesha, or what do you call it, Patanjali maybe even. He approaches his guru and asks a question, and his guru answers it. And the answer the guru gives to this question, what is the highest reality, that's recorded as the Adhara Karaka. So this tells you the adhikari of the type of person who should be studying this text. The person who would be interested in this text is not a person who's interested in, like, I don't know, doing Bhagala Mukhi Sadhana in order to win a court case or something. It's not a person who is interested in doing Bhairava Sadhana so they can become more self-assertive in life. All of that's great. That's no problem there. But it's about Bhairavi Nikila, good to see you, Mom. It's about attaining the highest reality. It's about jnana. If you're interested in knowing the ultimate truth, if you're interested in liberation, in moksha, then this is the text for you. It might not necessarily help you win your court case, or it might, I don't know, but it's not for that. It's not for winning your court case or becoming more beautiful or getting more money. All that's valid, by the way. And there are a lot of tantric things you can do for that, but this is not that kind of tantra. So verse 2 tells you what this is about. It's going to be about moksha, and it tells you it's going to be about the Paramartha Sara, the highest reality, and it tells you that it's something that a qualified student who desires that knowledge would come and get. Then verse 3 tells you that Abhinava Gupta is recasting it in the mold of Shaiva Shasana. Verse 4 is where you get the teaching. In verse 4, we learn that God is full, and out of his own fullness, the word is Bhagavan. So Bhagavan, out of his own fullness, pours forth the world in 4 stages or 4 expressions. So there's the 4 eggs idea, 4 wombs. One is the Shakti womb, the Maya womb, the Prakriti womb, and the Prithvi womb. So the power, the illusion, if you translate Maya that way, you don't have to. Maya can also be translated as delimiting power, the nature, and earth. So earth, nature, delimiting power, and power itself. These are the 4 wombs through which Lord Shiva pours forth the world. Now you can think of these as the four heads of Lord Shiva. Each head, like Agora is giving the Dakshinamnaya of Lalita Tripura Sundari, Vamadeva is giving the Kali Kula, so Vamadeva teaches us about Kali, and like that. Sadyojata, Tatpurusha is teaching the Purvamnaya, like Sadyojata is teaching the Kaubjika, something like that. Like each 4 heads are teaching the 4 different streams of Tantra, and the 5th head is Ishana, arguably teaching the Sarvamnaya, something like that. But the Ishana is Shiva, arguably. So the 1 contains the 4, or you can say the 1 contains the 5, however you want to understand it. But here 5 things are said. Bhagavan, Shiva, and his 4 powers. So the Shakti Anda means the egg of Shakti, the Maya Anda, the egg of Maya, the Prakriti Anda, the egg of Prakriti, and the Prithvi Anda, the egg of Prithvi. So you have 5 things, 5 principles. Arguably, these are the 5 powers of Lord Shiva, the 5 heads of Lord Shiva, but also they're the 5 levels of reality known as kalas. Not kala, kala means time. This is kala. So kala means like, arguably like art. It's divisions of reality. Jaima, Tessa, Jaima. Divisions of reality. So the first one is like nivritti, and then pratishta, and then vidya, and then shanta. So within these kalas are the tattvas, and within those tattvas are the bhuvanas. Okay, so the tattvas are contained within the kalas, and the bhuvanas are contained within the tattvas. These are all terms that you're familiar with. So the five kalas, beginning with nivritti, is just prithvi tattva, and then everything from up, water tattva, all the way up to prakriti tattva. These are all included in pratishta. So nivritti, pratishta. Then vidya would be everything from purusha all the way up to maya. So just those of you who have the tattva map in mind. Then everything beyond vidya would be called shanta, which is the supernals. These are everything beyond maya. So Shiva, Shakti, um, the Icha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, Kriya Shakti gets translated here as Sadashiva, Ishvara, and Shuddha Vidya. All of these arguably can be called Shanta, and that which is beyond all of this can be called Shanta Tita. In fact, you could even say everything from Maya to Shakti is Shanta, and Shiva himself is Shanta Tita. So Shiva, Shanta Tita, Shakti down to Maya, Shanta, Maya all the way down to Purusha will be Vidya, and Prakriti all the way down to Ap, the water element, will be Pratishta, and then Nivritti is just earth. So these are the five kalas, and they're subtly revealed by this verse, although they're never mentioned. The five heads of Lord Shiva are never mentioned. The five streams of Tantra are never mentioned. The five powers of Lord Shiva are never mentioned. The five kalas are never mentioned. And of course, you can read these four as also the four levels of the word. Para, Pashanti, Madhyama, Vaikari. All of that is encoded in verse number 4. And it's a wonderful verse because it allows a commentator to extricate all of these meanings. You know? It's remarkable. So Yoga Raja does this to some extent. But now, importantly, after we get this verse, we get verse 5, which is stunning. In verse 5, we learn one of the most important things in Somananda. And this is how coffee mugs are conscious. Shiva eva grihitva pashubhavaha. Abhinava Gupta tells us that Lord Shiva alone not only creates the world through his five powers or through his five faces or through his four eggs or through the four levels of the word or through the five kalas, like not only does Lord Shiva create the world out of his own fullness, he also enters into the world as an embodied experiencing subject for no other reason than to enjoy the world, to marvel at this world, to experience poetic rapture at the infinitude and beauty of the world that is none other than his very own being. So Shiva Eva, Lord Shiva alone, becomes a Dominique and a Joel G and a Nikila Devi. Like Lord Shiva alone assumes the form of a discrete unit of consciousness. For what? To savor, to enjoy. And so all the various bhuvanas, which means realms, each of them have beings. Some realms are like fairy realms. So they're beings with Gandharvas and Apsaras. So this tradition accepts a maximal view of reality where there are different lokas, different worlds in which there are different entities. And all of them are Shiva. And that's why Somananda says the craziest thing in chapter 1 of his text. In like verse 36 or something, he says, you know, there are beings who are in hell, who are suffering in hell. Because hell is also a loka. It's called Naraka. Naraka, like Rasatala, Patala, like that. These are all hells, right? They're not permanent like the Christian hell. They're like the states of transitory states that you can pass through, just like you can pass through the Gandharva Loka, the Pitri Loka. So there are beings in hell. So we accept this wholly. In the Shaiva tradition, we accept that there are hells, and we accept that there are certain karmas that you can perform that can take you to places like this in which horrible suffering occurs. You know? So, what about those beings in hell? And Somananda, he's crazy. He says, no, Shiva himself becomes beings in hell in order to enjoy the suffering of hell. So that's a remarkable idea that Shiva creates a world, and in this world there are heaven realms and hell realms and everything in between, Naga Loka and whatnot. There are all these different realms. See, there's a celebration to the Nagas coming up soon. Nag Panchami is coming up. Anyway, so like there are all these different realms. There are Nagas and Gandharvas and everything. And Lord Shiva becomes all the fellas in those realms, even in those hell realms in which the fellas suffer. Lord Shiva is happy to become a suffering fellow. You can even say he's one kinky motherfucker, but it's not suffering to him. It's an opportunity to experience something new. You know, just like how you would go and see a horror movie or eat spicy food, Lord Shiva, the supreme aesthete, desires to experience suffering in hell. So he goes to hell. You can say, like, go to hell, Shiva. And he's like, okay, that sounds fun. And then Somananda, right after he presents this hell thing, presents a metaphor. A king sometimes desires to play as a foot soldier. This is the example he gives. He says, a king has all the power in the world, but being so empowered, he desires some new leela, some new fun, which he can only have if he limits his power a little bit. So the king, in order to experience a new game, pretends to be a foot soldier and actually like goes into the trenches and does warfare along with like Shudras and whatnot, like along with the lowest of the low, arguably arguably from a hierarchical point of view. He likes that though. He likes becoming a foot soldier. Exactly. That's his, yeah, his desire for freedom, like arguably like he's so free that he like freely becomes bound. And then when he is bound, he can desire to become free. So like this desire is the point. That's the crazy thing about Shaivism. It's like this world is not born out of error or illusion. This world is born out of arousal. It's born out of desire to experience something new. And so to do that, he creates a world and he enters into the world and assumes the form of fettered souls. Pashu means bound soul. So Lord Shiva freely becomes bound because it's something new for him. The only thing the unlimited can desire is the limited, arguably. In one sense, the only thing the unlimited doesn't have is the limited. So for fun, he becomes the limited. And as the limited, he desires to be the unlimited. Like it's all part of his play. So Shiva is not in a desireless state. That's the idea. Like that's the kind of thing that's challenging because here Shiva, yeah, exactly, Paolo, you're exactly right. Shiva is not in a desireless state. In fact, he desires from fullness. So he's not, and that's why the discourse on verse 4 is very important. Because if you say that Shiva lacks something, like, oh, he's unlimited and he lacks limitation, or Shiva doesn't have something within him and now he wants to go and get it, or he's afraid of being alone all the time, then it's no longer God. Then he's no longer desireless. Then he's like desiring, and then he has karma in the Indian context. Now Shiva has karma, which is problematic. God can't have karma. So instead of saying that, we say no, there's another kind of desire, which is called, Somananda calls it nirvritti and aunmukhya. So nirvritti means in a quiescent state, Lord Shiva is still performing the activity of knowing himself. So even when he is perfectly calm and peaceful, like in the highest Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he is not without activity there. There's never a time when Shiva is without action. So what is the activity that he performs there? It's called, in one sense, self-knowing. Because he is consciousness, he is also self-conscious. But if you are an unlimited being, if you are God and you know that you're God, how will you feel? So happy, so replete. So nirvritti is described as a state of unlimited joy. It's called anavachinnananda, the bliss that is undivided, unlimited bliss. Then because of that bliss, so it's not because of anything, he doesn't need to get anything new or lose anything, just out of joy, because it's his nature to do so. Because of that, he then has aunmukhya. Aunmukhya means something like inward facing, but it has the connotation of delimiting an unlimited desire or unlimited bliss. So aunmukhya is like limiting the bliss in order to explore a particular possibility within that unlimited bliss. So let's say a king can be anything he wants in the kingdom. But then like this, he's just sitting on his throne, right? And he's feeling himself to be so powerful and is delighting in his power. And then one day he thinks, you know what would be fun? And this is when aunmukhya starts. So nirvritti is when he's unlimitedly reposing in his bliss. Aunmukhya, to speak in a temporal way, although all of these things happen instantaneously, aunmukhya is when he's like, you know what would be fun? If I was a foot soldier. Like now he's exploring one of the infinite possibilities in his being, namely being a foot soldier, right? So he starts to desire this. Then he has a will. Icha is when he like says, I will do it. Like he now has the eagerness, which then turns into a desire. So I don't like to translate icha as will. I prefer to translate it as desire or inspiration or creative impulse. Pratibha. So now he has his icha, and because of this icha, he can then know what it's like to be a foot soldier and act as a foot soldier. So his icha is essentially of the form, a desire to know and to do. So what is Lord Shiva? Lord Shiva is by definition a dynamic, self-aware reality which in fullness and repleteness desires always to know and to do. So Paula, you're right on the money here, Devi. It's like Shiva is never without desire. What it is to be Shiva is to be full of desire. It's his nature to be desired. That's why you desire. That's why you could say Bhairava is always erect. That's an important part in the iconography. He's always erect because there's never a time when he's not aroused. He's not full of desire, not full of aunmukhya, eagerness. Do you know, once, it was very interesting. I was talking to a great Shaiva Acharya, and I was with my partner and my wife, and I said to him, what is the difference between nirvritti and aunmukhya? Like, what's the difference between repleteness in quiescent joy and inward turning desire, limitation of desire? And he said, he pointed to Vijay and he said, that's your partner, right? When you look at her, you experience aunmukhya. That is the desire for her. And then when you unite with her in Yamala, that's nirvritti. But he inverted it, which is very interesting because usually nirvritti comes first, then comes aunmukhya. But here he was using more of this kind of nijananda, nirananda kind of model where he's like, oh, now I look at Vijaya and I see, I desire. And then through that desire, I have union. And through that union, I become replete. And think of that instantaneously. So that's what's happening within Shiva and Shakti all the time. Desire and union, desire and union. That's why Srima's drawing is so important. It captures the heart of the tradition, Yamala. Okay, so here's what happens. To speak temporally, to give you a temporal story of something that is actually atemporal, Shiva is nothing but nirvriti, consciousness replete with joy. That's what we get in verse 4. And because Shiva looks at himself inwardly, this is called aunmukya, because he relishes himself, he therefore has an eagerness. Aunmukya means eagerness, a delimitation of unlimited bliss. And that eagerness matures into will. That will is the will to be all this. You see it in the Purusha Shrutkam too. I am one, I will be many. So this will to be all this is the will to know and to do. Now, each individual in the universe, whether they are Naga in Naga Loka or an Apsara in some Indra Loka or something, each unique individual, including pots and pieces of cloth, each thing in this world is endowed with knowing, willing, and doing, because each thing is consciousness replete with joy, eagerly desiring to know, to will, and to do. Not only that, this entire world is the function of willing. For in willing the world into existence, Lord Shiva can become willing, knowing, doing things. So everything in the world is willing, knowing, and doing because Lord Shiva is a willing and knowing and doing reality. So it's a dynamic reality. So in verse 4 and verse 5, we get this highest teaching of Shaivism, which is the main feature in Somananda, which is Lord Shiva has nirvritti, aunmukya, icha shakti, jnana shakti, kriya shakti. And this is called the Shakti Traya, by the way. Jnana, kriya, icha. Sorry, icha, jnana, kriya, to give it an order. These are three Shaktis. They're goddesses. You can para, apara, para, para, maybe they're goddesses, but they're seen as powers. Now, goddesses are understood to be inseparable powers of Shiva. And then Abhinavagupta and Utpala add two more. This is not in Somananda. Somananda just says Nirvritti and Aunmukya. And Aunmukya and Icha are part of one thing. Aunmukya and Icha together form the will. Do you know? And actually, all of them, actually, to be really honest with you, Somananda doesn't distinguish them. They overlap. So like Nirvritti and Aunmukya and Icha and Jnana and Kriya, they're like Shiva Shakti again and again and again. So Nirvritti and Aunmukya is Shiva Shakti, and then Aunmukya and Icha is Shiva Shakti, and then Icha and Jnana is Shiva Shakti, and Jnana and Kriya is Shiva Shakti, like that. So they all overlap. Each one of these powers are overlapping with the one that came before and the one that comes after. So you can't draw clean lines to separate one from another. So that's a very important thing that I have to stress in today's talk, that like in Somananda, it's pure non-duality. It's like really difficult. Jaima. It's really difficult to like draw a line anywhere in the sand with Somananda. It's all like unitively one reality. Okay, so now we have this idea that there's um Shiva, and he's endowed at least with three powers: willing, knowing, and doing, which are all part of one. Willing, and willing is nothing but Shiva. But then what we get from Utpala and Abhinavagupta is two more powers: Chit Shakti and Ananda Shakti. So in Utpala and Abhinava, you have a pentad of powers: Chit Shakti, Ananda Shakti, Icha Shakti, Kriya Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti. Whereas in Somananda, you have a tetrad of powers: Icha, Jnana, and Kriya, which are all rooted in, importantly, Aunmukya, which is non-different from Nirvriti. So Lord Shiva is this dynamic reality who performs an action merely by knowing himself. Just by being, he knows that he is, and knowing that he is a kind of cognition, and the kind of cognition is a desire. He desires to know himself, and therefore he knows himself. So knowing himself is an action, which is of the form a cognition, which has its roots in a desire to know and to do. That's inseparably real in Shiva. Shiva is that conscious being who inseparably and always, eternally desires to know himself, and therefore he does know himself. To know himself is a kind of knowledge that precedes the action, which implies desire. So Shiva desires, and Shakti is that desire. That's all very refined metaphysics, but the idea is just that the bhuvanas, the realms, are created within Shiva by Shiva so that he can enter into them, as it were, as individual knowing, willing, doing subjects. So what's the point of all of this? Just to know yourself, or to know everything. To know everything is to know anything is to know yourself. To do anything is the point. So therefore, it's a philosophy of radical agency. It reclaims your desire, your creative inspiration. It invites you to participate in the world and savor the world and enjoy the world. For that's really the point. And that's where the Charvaka stuff can be reintegrated, actually. It's like the point is to enjoy the world. It's the case that there are deeper and deeper ways of enjoying the world, but that doesn't mean that you can't suck the sugarcane. That's good too. Even sucking the sugarcane is divine. For to suck the sugarcane is one instance in which Shiva is willing and knowing and doing. So I was looking at a cat under a car, and I was explaining this to a friend at dinner. And he's skeptical about all this kind of stuff, this willing, knowing, doing stuff. And I'm like, look at that cat. See? He's there, he's under the car, and he's curious. That curiosity is what I'm talking about. That inquiry, that desire to know. And once that cat knows, then he will do. He's waiting to catch some food that will fall from the dinner table. But once he knows that it's food, then he will eat the food, and then all of that is coming from desire. You can say he desires to know, he desires to do. In fact, he is there. The cat is there under the car at all. The car is there over the cat at all because Shiva desires to be a car. He desires to be a cat. He desires to know himself as a car, or to know himself as a cat, or to know himself as me talking to my friend, discussing the cat with its icha, with its jnana, and with its kriya. So the thing to know from Somananda is we get this icha, jnana, kriya trinity, which are all actually one thing: desire. Lord Shiva is a desiring God. That's, I think you can just put it that way, as Paula, like right on the money, said it. Shiva is a desire eternally. He's always desiring God and desires from fullness. That we get from verse 4 and verse 5. Okay, verse 4 and verse 5. Then verse 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all Purva Paksha stuff, meaning questions are asked about this philosophy and answers are given. We don't need to get into that now because we've talked about that extensively. But then verses 10 and all the way to the verse that we're studying now, all of those are about the tattvas. So tattvas are very important. They're the 24 from Sankhya, imported from Sankhya, and you add 11 more. The extra 11 are Maya with her 5 kanchukas, and then also the 5 Shaktis, the pentad of powers that we hear from Utpala and from Abhinavagupta more. But in Somananda, you can see it's kind of like you have Aunmukhya, Nirvriti, Aunmukhya, Icha, Jnana, Kriya, like 5 things. And those 5 things can be understood as Shiva and as Shakti. Though to be fair, Aunmukhya and Nirvriti is somewhere between Shiva and Shakti. So Shiva might be Nirvriti, but Aunmukhya is between Shiva and Shakti. Shakti is understood as Icha. In Somananda system, Shakti is Icha, and it's Sada Shiva that is Jnana actually, and it's Ishvara that is Kriya. It's very important. Whereas in Utpala Deva, I think it's Ananda Shakti. It's Shakti that is Aunmukhya or Ananda. It's Sadashiva that is Icha. It's Ishvara that is Jnana, and it's mantras or vidyas as Kriya. So like the understanding of where these powers fit in that pentad can be different from author to author. But generally you can say Shiva has 5 powers, he has 5 heads. So these 5 things, Shiva, Shakti, Sadashiva, Ishvara, and Shuddha Vidya, they're like the 5 realities that are actually one thing. And through Maya, which is nothing but 5 things also, if there are 5 aspects of Shiva, there are 5 ways to contract. So there's Kala, the contraction of agency. There is Vidya, the contraction of knowledge. And there is Raga, the contraction of desire. And then you can add to that Kala and Niyati, time and causation. So when you put all of these 5 together, you get Maya. So Maya plus the 5 is 6. 6 plus 5 gives you 11. And those 11 plus the 24 of Sankhya gives you 36. So the 36 Tattva model, which appears in the Malini Vijayotaro Tantra and elsewhere, is the dominant map of reality. And that's what the Paramartha Sara has been teaching us so far. It's been defining each of these things: Shiva, Shakti, Sadashiva, Ishvara, Shuddha Vidya, Maya, all the 5 Kanchakas of Maya. And now the real question is, the most important question is, so what is Purusha? How is it that Purusha is distinguished from Shiva? And what about me? So I feel myself to be a person, distinct from everyone else. And that's because of Prakriti. Everything from Prakriti down to Prithvi covers me with a mala. And now the language of malas, like the language of Maya, is notoriously absent from Somananda. Somananda doesn't talk about impurity. He sees everything as pure. But Abhinavagupta is willing to re-engage the concept of mala as well as Maya, because he's talking to a wider audience. But he's reinterpreting Mala just to mean intellectual, not intellectual, but failures of insight, if you will. So it's like more jnana oriented. They're not real ontological things. So I want to close out now by just suggesting that thus far in the text, we've explored the 36 tattvas within the context of the 5 kalas, within the context of the one Shiva who is endowed with replete bliss, in which articulations of desire occur, from which the universe emerges, in which we all have our being as willing, knowing, doing things. That's the claim. And so you're all Shiva. Only Shiva is, and he's playing as all of us. And the purpose of all of this is to remember that. The goal of this philosophy is not to go beyond the world, it's to enjoy the world, but as Shiva. The purpose of this world is not to see it as an illusion, but to see it for what it is, Shiva. never approach anything except as God. The idea is to divinize everything, including myself, and then one can eat and do whatever they want. One should enjoy. Like the point of the world is to enjoy your Shiva nature. And that's going to be different from person to person. So some people are going to enjoy their Shiva nature by going into a Himalayan cave and like shutting themselves off. Other people are going to enjoy their Shiva nature by becoming a queen and ruling over kingdoms. Some will start wars and do genocides. I don't know. It's unlikely that you'll do that when you realize that you're Shiva, but it's because you're Shiva that you're doing that, if that makes sense. You know, Shiva just wants to feel like what it's like to start a genocide or be in a genocide, and therefore there's a genocide. Like everything is happening by Lord Shiva's will, but it's not just his will, it's his play. It's his playful desire. It's his icha. And whenever I'm saying he, I'm talking about Shiva. But notice I choose to think of that as Kali. So from a devotional point of view, there's no point of distinguishing them. No reason why to distinguish them. I prefer Kali, but someone might prefer Shiva. Someone might prefer Vishnu. It really doesn't matter. They all mean the same thing. This one consciousness, which I call Kali, who is a desiring deity. And through her desire, all of this appears. So how do we learn all of this? And this is the fact that we are learning it at all is really cool because I think this is the coolest philosophy ever. But how do we learn all this? Because of the unbroken transmission of gurus that have occurred since time immemorial with Shiva at the beginning of the lineage. And so I want to close now by just pointing you to this beautiful verse. I'm sorry, I didn't break it up nicely, but there's this beautiful verse in here. I just put it in the Discord, and it's one of the verses from the Tantra Sara, the beginning of the Tantra Sara, which Abhinavagupta writes to help you with the Tantra Loka. That's another thing. In verse 2 of the Tantra Sara, he says, the Tantra Loka is too difficult. Many people don't have the time to enter into its oceanic depths. So I'm going to write the Tantra Sara to help you. It's beautiful. And then the verse 3, he says this, Shri Shambhunatha Bhaskara Charani Pata Prabha Pagata Shankocham. So he's saying, no, then the next one. Abhinava Gupta Hridam Bujam Etad Vinchinuta Mahesha Pujana Hetuhu. Sorry, it's a little small here. But the idea here is that Mahesha Pujana Hetuhu. So for the sake of Hetu, because, or if you want to worship Puja Mahesha, if you want to worship Shiva, please pick one by one these lotus petals of the heart, Hrid Ambuja of Abhinavagupta. So the lotus heart of Abhinavagupta. Oh, my friend, if you want to worship the Lord Shiva, please accept my lotus heart, in which contraction, sankocha, has been forever ended. That's an important point. In his heart, contraction, limitation has forever ended, which has bloomed open through the touch of the rays of his guru, the rays of his guru's feet, the revered son Shambhunatha, Shri, the auspicious Shambhunatha, the rays of whose feet, Bhaskara, Charana, Pata, the rays that fall. Bhaskara means rays, Pata means fall. So the grace in the form of illumination that falls from the feet of my auspicious Guru, Shri Shambhunatha. Through that, the contraction in my heart has been forever ended. My heart has bloomed open. And so if you, my friend, want to worship Shiva, please accept my lotus heart. And with that, do your puja. What a remarkable verse. And I just want to point to this idea of sankocha. Like this whole conversation that we're having now about Jiva and Shiva and insentient entities or sentient entities, they all have to do with this word sankocha. Lord Shiva is unlimited, but part of his joy is delimitation. So Aunmukya itself refers to the unlimited, delimiting itself for the sake of art. So we are the limited Shiva. Through sankocha, Shiva becomes Nish or a cat or a rock. Now what we're doing here is the reverse process where we are removing contraction. Once you do that, by the way, you can contract at will. So like right now, my hand is clenched into a fist. I'm like Arthur the Aardvark, you know. And then this is what a jiva is. A pashu, a jiva, is a contracted fist within Shiva. This, the Abhaya Mudra, is that unlimited expanse. So going from jiva to Shiva is the point. Just unclenching my asshole. That's the idea. You know, we're all assholes because we're clenching the asshole. Just release the asshole. Release the hold on the asshole. Release the asshole. And then you get Sankocha becomes Unmesha, this expansion. And that expansion is what happens when we get initiated by the Guru, which here means when we receive the revelation of non-duality from the rays that fall from the feet of the auspicious teacher who has forever given us assholeness. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. That's that. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanam Astu.